it's really a lot of consideration by this House to adjourn all other business to discuss this particular matter, a matter that is of grave concern, Mr. Speaker, to all the Kenyan people, Mr. Speaker. And as I had earlier stated while moving the motion, Mr. Speaker, that there has been conflict, ongoing conflict between the herders, the private ranchers, and security agencies, Mr. Speaker. And this has contributed to a lot of loss of life and also now loss of livestock, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, at this particular time, when drought is already hitting hard on our people, it was very unfortunate to continue losing livestock in unnecessary ways, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, it is natural to lose livestock through drought, but it is very painful to lose livestock through the gun. Mr. Speaker, the pain, the anger, the despair, and frustration that this atrocious act has caused to all the pastoralist communities is unthinkable. It's unimaginable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there have been a lot of hue and cry. And particularly, Mr. Speaker, whereas the drought has forced the pastoralists into very difficult circumstances across the country, in all parts, Mr. Speaker, and we are all suffering from different directions. Just the other day, Mr. Speaker, livestock from Kajiado County that crossed the border to Tanzania were auctioned by the Tanzanian government, around 1,300 and that kind of number, Mr. Speaker. And we are still going through the pain and the trauma of losing that livestock. And back at home, Mr. Speaker, here in our own country, that our own security agents will take their guns that have been bought using taxpayers' money to kill our livestock, to sabotage our economy, an economy that we have depended upon, Mr. Speaker. Livestock that have brought a number of us who are in this house, that has been our school fees. Those cattle have been our banks, Mr. Speaker. It's like uprooting coffee. It's like uprooting tea in the coffee and tea regions, Mr. Speaker. This is the pain we feel, Mr. Speaker. And so, due to public demand, Mr. Speaker, I had to bring this motion to the floor of this honorable House, hoping to indulge the members, Mr. Speaker, and to look for a lasting solution, Mr. Speaker. Particularly in Laikipia, Mr. Speaker, in that very rugged plateau, the poor herders, the settlers, large-scale and small-scale farmers, commercial cattle ranchers, tour operators, passionate wildlife activists, elephants, lions, hyenas, goats, zebras, are all competing for the same space, Mr. Speaker. Laikipia has profound inequalities, Mr. Speaker, in land ownership, with 40.3% of the land being controlled only by 48 individuals, Mr. Speaker. But even with this kind of inequality, Mr. Speaker, it has been apparent that the ranchers cannot countenance the idea of ever giving up the giant parcels of land to the original owners, Mr. Speaker. Some have been offloading the land to other rich people, some of whom are foreigners, Mr. Speaker, while top business Thank you. You know, one would wonder whether the sabotage begins from here. Mr. Speaker, political elites, business people in the country have also increasingly acquired land there. Thousands of herders who are being chased by the drought, and I blame this situation entirely on the drought, Mr. Speaker, in Laikipia. The herders are being pushed by the biting drought, Mr. Speaker. They've invaded farms, ranches, and wildlife conservancies, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the key thing is how our security forces to deal with this situation, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, one wrong cannot correct another wrong. A bullet on a cow will not be able to solve the situation, Mr. Speaker. The conflict between the pastoralists and the ranchers is bound to escalate as drought ravages large parts of the country. And as more pastoral land, Mr. Speaker, is converted into conservancies. But once it rains normally, Mr. Speaker, the pastoralists always go back to their areas of abode in peace. And I underline, in peace. They always go back in peace. The community has many adaptation measures to cope with the impact of climate extremes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it has just been discussed in the immediate motion on the effects of climate change that, Mr. Speaker, we will need to address as a